Assassin's Creed has been in an identity crisis for almost 2 decades now. Every single game in the franchise has fundamentally changed how combat works, from patient counter kills to full-blown RPG ability spam. Today, I'm breaking down the complete evolution of combat across every mainline Assassin's Creed game and what each one got right and wrong, starting with the one that established the rules everyone else would eventually break, Assassin's Creed 1. The original Assassin's Creed came out in 2007, and if you go back and play it today, the combat feels like it belongs to a completely different franchise, because it kind of does. The entire system was built around one core philosophy: you are not supposed to be fighting. Every prolonged sword fight in this game was the developers quietly telling you that you messed up. Here's the thing: combat in the original game was entirely defense first. The system split between low profile and high profile actions, and holding the high profile button while pressing attack made Altair swing aggressively, but the real key to combat was the counter system. You were literally waiting for enemies to come to you, holding block, reading their attack animations, and responding with precise timing on the counter. That was the entire combat loop. Patience, observation, reaction. By modern standards, it's almost punishingly slow, but the weapon selection is where it gets interesting. You had 4 main melee options: fists, hidden blade, short blade, and sword, plus throwing knives for ranged attacks, and each one actually mattered. The hidden blade was far and away the most lethal weapon in the game because every successful counter with it resulted in an instant kill. 1 clean read, 1 dead guard. The trade-off was that its counter window was significantly tighter than the sword's, so you were trading forgiveness for lethality. Meanwhile, trying to fight anyone with your bare fists was an exercise in futility. You could grab and throw enemies around, but actually killing anyone that way felt like slapping a brick wall with a pool noodle. Weapon choice wasn't cosmetic. It was a genuine tactical decision that determined how much risk you were willing to accept. And that limited arsenal reinforced something the series would spend the next 17 years slowly abandoning. Direct combat was designed as a failure state. If you were standing in a circle of guards trading blows for 2 minutes, you had already failed your assassination approach. The game wanted you sneaking, blending, planning. It wanted you to be a cautious assassin who avoids confrontation whenever possible. That philosophy is the DNA of this entire franchise. Every single game that came after is either building on it or actively rebelling against it. And the very next entry, it chose rebellion almost immediately. The Ezio trilogy, Assassin's Creed 2, didn't just give you a new protagonist, it gave you permission to stop being careful. See, Altair's combat was built around waiting. You stood there, you read the enemy, you countered when the moment was right. Ezio's combat was built around moving forward. And the philosophical gap between those two approaches is the single most important shift in the franchise's history, because everything that came after was a direct response to what happened here. The counter kill system was the foundation. You'd wait for an enemy to attack, hit the counter button at the right moment, and Ezio would execute them with a brutal cinematic animation. Simple, reliable, and it made you feel like a god. But Brotherhood introduced the real game changer, the kill streak system. After landing a counter kill, you could flick the analog stick toward the next enemy and press attack to chain into another instant kill. No pause, no reset, no thought required, just a continuous chain of eliminations that looked like a choreographed action sequence. Double assassinations let you drop 2 enemies simultaneously. You weren't thinking like an assassin anymore. You were a medieval blender with a Renaissance hat, and the weapon variety made Altair's kit look like a starter pack. Ezio could wield the hidden blade alongside a sword, fire the hidden gun mid-combat, deploy the poison blade, and by Constantinople in Revelations, you were strapping bombs to your loadout alongside everything else. Altair had his sword, hidden blade, throwing knives, and fists. Ezio had an entire armory on his person at all times. Every encounter had multiple solutions available before you even engaged. Here's the thing though. The system had a fatal flaw baked directly into its DNA, and it only got worse the longer you played. Throwing knives, generous supply restocked from any blacksmith or loot drop. Medicine, instant full heals from your inventory at basically any moment. Bombs and Revelations could clear half a courtyard before a single guard drew his sword. By late game, the question wasn't whether you'd survive a fight. It was whether the fight would last long enough for you to finish your sandwich. And that's the paradox Ubisoft accidentally built for themselves. The kill streaks looked incredible. They felt incredible. Watching Ezio flow from one execution to the next with zero hesitation was genuinely one of the most satisfying combat experiences in gaming at the time. But satisfaction and challenge are two completely different things, and the Ezio trilogy chose satisfaction every single time without exception. The series went from punishing aggression to outright celebrating it, and it would spend the next decade trying to figure out whether that was actually a good idea. Turns out, the answer was complicated, but before Ubisoft could even begin to course correct, they decided to tear the entire combat system down and rebuild it from scratch, which naturally went about as smoothly as you'd expect. Assassin's Creed 3. Let's just call this what it is. Assassin's Creed 3 looked at the Batman Arkham games, said yeah we want that, and rebuilt their entire combat system from scratch to make it happen. Released in October 2012, AC3 ditched everything from the Ezio era and implemented a free-flow system directly mirrored from Rocksteady's framework. Connor doesn't fight like Ezio. He doesn't fight like Altair. He fights like Batman in a tricorn hat. And honestly, the translation was messy. Here's the thing. The Arkham games worked because they were designed around enclosed combat arenas with clearly telegraphed enemy attacks. Every thug had a visible windup, every attack type had a distinct animation, and the camera framed everything so you could read the entire encounter at a glance. Assassin's Creed 3 tried to transplant that philosophy into sprawling wilderness environments where enemies attacked from behind trees, telegraph visibility was inconsistent, and the camera couldn't decide if it wanted to be cinematic or functional, which is, not ideal, but Connor did bring some genuinely new ideas to the table. The Predator move system was his signature innovation. While perched on tree branches, you could use the rope dart to hang a target from the branch, leaving them dangling like a very confused piñata. It introduced verticality as an actual tactical element for the first time. The catch? It only worked in specific forest contexts. Step into a city and that entire mechanic just vanished from your toolkit. The multi-counter system expanded on what Brotherhood started, letting Connor counter multiple attacks in sequence during group fights. Sounds great on paper. In practice, each counter triggered an extended animation that locked you in place, and while Connor was busy performing his choreographed takedown on one guy, two others could freely swing at his back. You couldn't just mash the counter button and zone out. You had to track which enemy was winding up next, reposition between animations, and maintain constant spatial awareness. It was the first time since the original game that button mashing could genuinely get you killed. The rope dart also worked beyond tree hangings, becoming Connor's go-to for pulling enemies toward him, and tomahawks replaced swords as the preferred weapon, fitting his character archetype way better than watching a Kanyen Keihaka warrior swing a rapier around. But underneath all these additions, the fundamental problem remained. Combat was still animation-based, not hitbox-based. Every strike was a commitment to a full animation, and enemies existed in this weird state of invincibility between your inputs and the game deciding they were allowed to take damage. Despite rebuilding everything from the ground up, once you hit high ranks with upgraded gear, combat still felt trivially easy. Connor could mow through entire platoons of redcoats without breaking a sweat. Ubisoft borrowed another franchise's combat identity, and the result was a system that looked impressive, but couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. But if you think borrowing from Batman was a bold move, wait until you see what happened when they strapped Connor's granddad to a pirate ship. Black Flag and Rogue. Here's the thing about Black Flag and Rogue. The best combat system in the entire Assassin's Creed franchise up to this point had absolutely nothing to do with being an assassin. Not even a little bit. It involved cannons, ramming speed, and setting the ocean on fire, which is, not ideal for a series about sneaky guys in hoods. Black Flag in 2013 and Rogue in 2014 essentially split the franchise into two parallel games running simultaneously. On land, you had the same simplified free-flow melee inherited from AC3. Edward Kenway could dual-wield two swords, rock dual hidden blades, swing rope darts, and fire up to 4 flintlock pistols at once. Sounds incredible on paper. In practice, it was the same counterweight kill loop wearing a pirate hat. The variety was there, but the depth wasn't. But then you got on a ship. And suddenly Assassin's Creed became a genuine strategy game. Naval combat operated on completely different principles than anything the franchise had ever attempted. Every weapon system on your ship demanded specific timing, positioning, and sequencing. Chase cannons fired from the bow to hit ships directly ahead of you. you. Broadside cannons could be aimed high or low and scaled their devastation based on range and timing. Heavy shot functioned like a maritime shotgun, absolutely devastating at close range but useless from a distance. Fire barrels could be dropped behind your ship to punish anyone foolish enough to tail you, and the ram itself, with proper upgrades, could one-shot smaller vessels on contact. The real depth came from chaining these systems together. Weaken a ship with your chase cannons on approach, close the distance, ram it while it's still reeling, then immediately swing perpendicular and unload your broadsides directly into the hull. The mortar sat at the top of the precision food chain, dealing massive damage from extreme range if you could land the shot. Every engagement became a puzzle of approach vectors and weapon sequencing. You had to think about positioning the way a chess player thinks about the board, except the board is on fire and there are 3 schooners trying to flank you. Rogue took this already sophisticated system and added Templar-specific toys. The puckle gun sat at the front of the ship, providing rapid-fire damage perfect for shredding weak points and softening targets before closing to ram distance. Burning oil trailed flames behind your ship like the world's most aggressive do not follow sign, preventing pursuit entirely. And the grenade launcher lobbed explosive projectiles in an arc, letting you bombard clustered enemies or hit ships hiding behind cover with indirect fire. The irony here is thick enough to sail through. Assassin's Creed accidentally proved it could design deep, strategic, genuinely demanding combat. Weapon sequencing, positioning awareness, approach angle management, resource timing, all the ingredients of a sophisticated combat system were right there. They just put them on a boat instead of in the hands of the actual assassin. Edward Kenway standing on a deck somewhere in the Caribbean, dual swords drawn, surrounded by 6 guards he's about to counter-kill in 8 seconds flat. Meanwhile, his ship is parked in the harbor, being a more complex combat experience than anything the franchise had produced in 6 years. But if you think the franchise was content to let its on-foot combat stay in the shadow of its own naval warfare forever, Unity was about to change everything, and not gently. Unity, Ubisoft looked at 5 games of players effortlessly carving through entire armies and essentially said, okay, that's enough of that. Unity didn't just tweak the combat, it ripped the whole thing out and replaced it with something that actively punished you for playing like you'd been playing since 2009. The philosophy behind Unity's combat was fencing, not the broad cinematic swordplay of previous entries, but actual fencing. Tight, precise, and built entirely around timing and positioning. The parry system demanded you press the button with precise timing as an enemy attacked. You had to actually read the animations and react. This wasn't the old counter system where you could hold a button and wait for something to happen. This was deliberate mechanical execution that demanded you watch what enemies were doing and respond accordingly. And the reward structure was brutal. Landing well-timed parries opened up windows for counterattacks, letting you deal meaningful damage. But miss your parry window, and you're eating a hit you absolutely cannot afford. You're stuck on the defensive, surrounded by enemies who are now very much trying to kill you, and Arno Dorian is about as durable as a wet paper towel. That's not an exaggeration. Arno was deliberately designed to be fragile. Previous protagonists could absorb hits like they were getting pelted with tennis balls. Arno takes a few solid strikes and he's done. 2 guards flanking you wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence if you weren't paying attention. Ubisoft went further. They stripped back the tools players had relied on for years. No more chain kills, no more standing in the middle of a crowd and systematically executing everyone who approached. Every single change pointed in the same direction. You will learn the combat system or you will die repeatedly. Hey, remember how you've been mashing attack for half a decade? Yeah, stop that. The launch reception was, predictably, a mess. Players who had spent years trivializing combat suddenly couldn't handle 3 guards in an alley. Forums exploded with complaints about unfair difficulty and broken mechanics, which is, not ideal when you're also dealing with faces melting through floors and characters falling through the map. But here's where it gets interesting. Retrospective analysis of Unity's combat has been increasingly kind. Years removed from the launch disaster, players started recognizing what Ubisoft was actually trying to do. The fencing philosophy created a genuine middle ground that the franchise had never found before. The original Assassin's Creed was almost entirely defensive, where you stood still and waited for enemies to attack. The Ezio trilogy through Black Flag was almost entirely offensive, where you mashed buttons and watched beautiful kill animations play out. Unity sat right between those extremes. You had to read attacks, you had to execute with precision, but you also had real offensive windows when you earned them through skilled play. Was it perfect? No. the parry timing could feel inconsistent, and the difficulty spike from previous entries alienated a huge chunk of the player base. But Unity proved something important. Assassin's Creed combat could demand real skill without abandoning the series entirely. It just had the misfortune of proving it during the most technically broken launch in franchise history. But if Unity's fencing experiment felt like a hard reset, Syndicate's response was to throw the rulebook out entirely and just start punching people in the face. Syndicate is the franchise trying to have it both ways. After Unity punished players for breathing too aggressively near a guard, Ubisoft pulled back in 2015 with a brawler system that wanted to feel brutal and satisfying without scaring anyone off. Jacob and Evie Fry swung fists and canes through Victorian London like they were starring in a Guy Ritchie film, and the result was a combat system that looked harder than it actually was. Here's the thing. Syndicate's combat leaned heavily into a rhythm-based flow. The game wanted you to build up kill streaks by timing your attacks correctly and chaining hits together without getting interrupted. You couldn't just lock on and mash. You had to read enemy attack telegraphs, time your counters, and keep your combo momentum going. Miss a beat and the streak resets. It's less fighting game and more aggressive percussion with brass knuckles. And this is where the multi-kill system comes in. If you built up a high enough streak through sustained, unbroken offense, a successful hit on one target would flow directly into an execution animation on the next nearby enemy. No pause, no reset, just seamless brutality chaining from one kill to the next. Get a streak going, and you'd trigger multi-kills that looked absolutely cinematic. The game was basically rewarding you for maintaining flawless offensive rhythm through entire encounters. But here's where Syndicate quietly undermined its own design. The counter window was enormously generous. Enemy attacks were heavily telegraphed with clear visual indicators, and the timing required to land a successful counter was so forgiving that missing one took genuine effort. As long as you were paying even minimal attention, sustained damage was basically impossible. So the rhythm system existed, and it was genuinely satisfying when you engaged with it, but the difficulty floor was so low that you never really had to master it. The weapon situation made this even more apparent. Kukris, cane swords, brass knuckles, they all looked different. They had stat variations in speed, damage, and stun, but in practice, those differences rarely changed how you actually played. You'd still counter, combo, and chain kills the same way regardless of what you were holding. The game essentially encouraged players to pick whatever looked coolest and make sure their gear stayed at the right level. That's a telling design choice when you think about it. Unity had tried to make every weapon choice matter tactically. Syndicate looked at that approach and said, nah, just pick the pretty one. Throwing knives and the revolver made things even simpler. Ranged options could trivialize encounters that the streak system was supposedly designed to make interesting. So you had this weird contradiction where the game built a genuinely satisfying combat rhythm and then handed you about 4 different ways to skip it entirely. The dual protagonist setup with Jacob and Evie promised different combat experiences, and to their credit, there were some differences. Jacob's skill tree leaned toward direct combat with stronger melee damage. Evie's leaned toward stealth with tools like chameleon invisibility, but in actual open combat encounters, the core mechanics played out nearly identically for both characters. Syndicate sits in this strange middle ground in the franchise's history. It's more demanding than the Ezio games, but more forgiving than Unity. It introduced a streak-based combat rhythm that was genuinely satisfying for the series, then undermined it with generous counter windows and minimal weapon differentiation. The fact that weapon choice barely altered your approach foreshadows something massive though, because the next game wouldn't just make weapons feel different, it would rebuild the entire combat system from scratch to make sure they did. Origins. This is the big one. October 27th, 2017, the day Assassin's Creed stopped being Assassin's Creed for a significant chunk of its fan base. And honestly, both sides of that argument have a point. Origins didn't just tweak the combat system, it burned the entire thing to the ground and rebuilt it from scratch. Every single game before this used animation-based combat, meaning your attacks played out through pre-scripted sequences. You pressed the button, the game decided if the hit connected based on the animation playing out. Origins replaced all of that with a hitbox architecture. where positioning, weapon size, and weapon speed determine whether or not an attack actually lands. No more waiting for choreographed kill animations. No more enemies standing politely in a circle. This is a fundamentally different game now, and the weapon system reflected that. A wide variety of distinct weapons, ranging from common to legendary rarity, each with unique statistics affecting damage, speed, range, and special properties like critical hit chance or bleed. Heavier weapons like maces dealt more damage per strike, but consumed more stamina and left you stuck in longer recovery windows. Lighter weapons let you chain faster sequences, but required more hits to bring enemies down. For the first time in the franchise, picking your weapon wasn't cosmetic. It was a genuine tactical decision that changed how every single fight played out. Bayek's shield functioned both defensively for blocking and offensively for bashing to create openings, which sounds simple until you're surrounded by 4 enemies who are all attacking at the same time. Because that's the other massive change. Enemies no longer politely waited their turn. They attacked simultaneously, forcing genuine multi-enemy management instead of the sequential, one-at-a-time duels the series had relied on for a decade. The adrenaline gauge, built during combat and could be spent on devastating overpower attacks that dealt massive damage. And the Predator Bow introduced precision mechanics that let you actually steer arrows mid-flight, which is, not something real bows do, but it looked incredible. Here's where the controversy gets real though. Veteran players had a very specific complaint, and it wasn't just nostalgia talking. The hitbox system created this perceived disconnection between inputs and results. You'd swing your weapon, it would visually appear to connect with an enemy's body, and the hit would just miss, because the hitbox didn't align with what you were seeing on screen. Your sword passes through a guy's torso and he takes 0 damage. That's not a skill issue. That's a trust issue between the player and the game's own feedback systems. Then there was level gating. You could be the most mechanically skilled player on the planet, perfectly reading attack patterns, dodging everything, positioning flawlessly, and still lose because the enemy was several levels above you and your numbers simply weren't big enough. That's not combat. That's a stat check. And for a franchise that originally rewarded nothing but player skill and timing regardless of progression, that felt like a betrayal to a lot of people. The criticism that Origins turned Bayek into a hard-headed warrior rather than a cunning assassin captures the tension perfectly. This wasn't a refinement of Assassin's Creed combat. This was a philosophical identity crisis packaged as a game, the most ambitious evolution the series had ever attempted, and simultaneously the most controversial thing it had ever done. But if Origins divided the fan base, the next 2 games were about to pour gasoline on the fire and light a match. Odyssey and Valhalla, Odyssey and Valhalla are where the RPG philosophy hits its absolute ceiling, for better and worse. These 2 games took everything Origins introduced and cranked every dial to maximum, building combat systems so dense with resource bars, ability cooldowns, and stat dependencies that you could genuinely forget you were playing an Assassin's Creed game. Some of it is genuinely brilliant design, but some of it is the philosophical opposite of everything the series started as. Odyssey dropped in October 2018 and immediately introduced a specialized ability system that made Origins look restrained. You had 3 distinct ability trees consuming Hunter, Warrior, and Assassin points, each offering moves that fundamentally changed how you approached combat. Multi-shot let you fire up to 8 arrows simultaneously at max upgrade tier, absolutely shredding groups. Slow time activated on a perfect dodge, giving you a ridiculous window to reposition or murder everyone before they could react. The cooldown mechanics meant you couldn't spam abilities endlessly, which sounds like good design on paper. In practice, you'd blow your flashy moves, then spend 30 seconds doing basic light attacks waiting for everything to recharge. Not exactly the assassin fantasy, but Valhalla is where things got genuinely interesting and genuinely problematic at the same time. Released November 2020, Valhalla drew a hard line between abilities and skills. Abilities were your big, flashy combat moves fueled by adrenaline, and you could map up to 8 simultaneously. 4 ranged, 4 melee. The skill tree was massive and split across 3 branches. Bear went full aggressive melee. Wolf specialized in ranged combat and bow proficiency. Raven was the closest thing to classic Assassin's Creed, offering stealth bonuses and assassination damage. 3 genuinely distinct playstyles in one game. Credit where it's due. Then there's stamina management. Heavy attacks and dodging consumed visible stamina bars that needed recovery time. Enemies had stun bars that, when depleted, triggered a stagger and opened them up for brutal finishers. Attack cancellation let you evade mid-animation through specific button combos, which was welcome after years of animation lock. Here's the thing though. Player stamina was essentially the only meaningful limitation in the entire combat loop. Enemy AI almost never punished you for depleting your stamina bar. You'd burn through everything, stand there recovering, and enemies would just kind of politely wait. The system created the appearance of tactical depth without the teeth to back it up. Valhalla also introduced dual wielding that went further than any previous entry. 2 separate weapons, shields paired with one-handers, even a shield in each hand if you felt like being ridiculous. You could apply runes for stat modifications, further customizing your loadout. The sheer volume of options was staggering, but the criticism that hit hardest was the power level system. It didn't matter how perfectly you read enemy patterns or how flawlessly you executed your dodges and parries. If you were underleveled, you were losing. Mechanical excellence alone could not overcome substantial stat disadvantages. Combat had transformed from a skill-based engagement into a stat check. Your equipment quality and character progression mattered more than your positioning, your timing, or your pattern reading. Think about that for a second. In the original Assassin's Creed, you could beat any enemy in the game with nothing but the hidden blade and good timing. 17 years later, you could play perfectly and still get destroyed because your number was smaller than their number. That's not evolution, that's a philosophical U-turn. The distance from AC1 to Valhalla is now maximum. You've gone from read the enemy and counter precisely to check your stats and manage your resource bars. Whether that's progress or regression depends entirely on what you think Assassin's Creed is supposed to be. But there's one more game that tried to answer that question directly: Mirage. After nearly a decade of bloated skill trees, level-gated assassinations, and loot systems that would make a Diablo developer blush, Ubisoft did something nobody expected. They hit the brakes. Assassin's Creed Mirage, released October 5th, 2023, deliberately abandoned every RPG mechanic the franchise had spent 3 games building and went back to the beginning. Not spiritually, literally. This is a game where a hidden blade to the neck kills someone regardless of what number is floating above their head. Revolutionary stuff in 2023, apparently. Basim's toolkit is the entire point. 5 core tools, each with a specific job. Throwing knives handle short to mid-range eliminations. Noisemakers scatter guards like pigeons. Traps control the battlefield with proximity triggers. Smoke bombs obscure vision for multi-target kills or emergency escapes. And blow darts silently put targets to sleep from a distance. That's it. No ability wheel with 47 glowing icons. No adrenaline bar feeding into a super move that shoots lightning from your eyes. Just 5 tools and the intelligence to use them correctly. Here's where it gets genuinely elegant though. Each tool has 3 upgrade tiers that fundamentally change how you approach problems. Throwing knives progress from a basic single throw to a version that retrieves itself from the target to one that lets you hurl multiple knives at once. Every upgrade path asks the same question the original game asked: what's your plan and which tool executes it best? Traps go from simple tripwires to tools that chain between multiple enemies. The whole system is tight, deliberate, and refreshingly free of bloat. Assassin's Focus is Mirage's signature mechanic, essentially the kill streak system from Brotherhood rebuilt entirely around stealth instead of open combat. Activating it triggers temporal deceleration, letting you tag multiple enemies for sequential elimination, but you earn it through stealth kills. Each clean assassination fills a portion of the focus bar, and each use lets you chain together marked kills in rapid succession. Get spotted by 3 guards simultaneously. Focus handles that. Need to clear a rooftop before infiltrating a restricted area? Focus handles that too. It rewards the exact behavior the game wants you to exhibit, which is something the RPG entries completely forgot how to do. Chain Assassination carries forward the earlier game's multi-kill concept, letting you swiftly take down 2 enemies in sequence while maintaining stealth-first philosophy. It works better here because the entire game is built to support it rather than treating it as one option among 100, and then there's a detail that doesn't get enough attention. Mirage received full Arabic voice acting featuring Ayad Nassar as Basim, not a token dub, a complete ground-up localization that treats the setting's language and culture as integral to the experience. For a game about returning to what Assassin's Creed was always supposed to be, that commitment to authenticity mirrors the mechanical philosophy perfectly. It's not just about going back to stealth-first gameplay, it's about respecting the world you're building that gameplay inside of. The return to stealth-focused combat, where proper technique overcomes equipment disparity, is a philosophical admission. It's Ubisoft acknowledging whether they'd phrase it this way or not, that 3 games of RPG progression had systematically undermined the core fantasy of being a skilled assassin who succeeds through clever problem solving rather than statistical overwhelming. Mirage doesn't have the scope of Valhalla or the build variety of Odyssey. What it has is a clear answer to the question the franchise has been asking since 2017. Can you go home again? Turns out, yeah, you can. You just have to actually want to. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.